All right, we're now talking about section 3 of chapter 14 on the nervous system and the spinal cord. And now we're talking about the sectional anatomy of the spinal cord and spinal roots. The objectives you should be able to have learned when you've gone through the section, or at least you should get reasonable understanding of before moving on, is to identify the 4 anatomic locations of gray matter on either side of the spinal cord, describe the structures that form each gray matter region, trace the sensory input in the spinal cord and motor output from the spinal cord, identify the location of white matter in the spinal cord, and list the 3 anatomic divisions of the white matter and explain their general composition. For distribution of gray matter, the gray matter is made of the neurons' cell bodies, the dendrites, and unmyelinated axons, also glial cells. The masses of gray matter project from the center of the spinal cord. The posterior horns house the axons of the sensory neurons and the cell bodies of the interneurons. The anterior horns house the cell bodies of the somatic motor neurons, and the lateral horns house the cell bodies of the autonomic motor neurons, but they're only present in parts T1 to L2. Now, the distribution of the gray matter with gray commissure is the horizontal band of gray matter surrounding the central canal. It contains unmyelinated axons that are connecting left and right gray matter. The nuclei are groups of cell bodies. The sensory nuclei are the posterior horn containing the interneurons, with the somatic sensory nuclei receiving signals for the skin, the muscles, the joints, and the visceral sensory nuclei receiving signals for the blood vessels and the viscera. The motor nuclei in the anterior and the lateral horns contain the motor neurons, with the somatic motor nuclei in the anterior and the innervate skeletal muscle, and the autonomic motor nuclei in the lateral portion there, innervating smooth muscle, heart, and glands. So here we have a visual of our cross-section of our spinal cord and the spinal roots. A little bigger here. You can see now the blue, remember the blue is going to be our somatic sensory nuclei, lighter blue I should say, the darker blue is the visceral sensory nuclei, and then the autonomic or visceral motor nuclei here, showing the orange, and our somatic motor nuclei and the red there, going from posterior to anterior. So here we have our posterior median sulcus, and we have this posterior root coming here, the somatic sensory neuron and visceral sensory neurons, the posterior root ganglion here, this being their spinal nerve itself, and then the separation course going into anterior here with the autonomic visceral motor neuron or neurons, and then the somatic motor neurons coming through this direction for each nerve, and then for each vertebrae. For the anterior median fissure here, these are interneurons here, communicating between neurons, the posterior horn being here, and the posterior funiculus, or one of them here, lateral funiculus here, central canal, of course, lateral horn, the gray commissure, it's right in here, and the anterior horn, and anterior funiculus. And actually I wanted to mention too, to make sure we're clear, did we say, I think we said, but to be clear, part of that somatic and visceral sensory input there, the posterior root, the somatic sensory being the tactile receptors and the proprioceptors, the visceral sensory being the baroreceptors and chemoreceptors, to that posterior root, to the posterior aspect of the spinal cord, of the vertebra. And the effectors, the autonomic effectors and the somatic effectors, of course, are communicating there with the anterior root. For distribution of white matter, the white matter is essentially it's myelinated axons, that's why it's white, to and from the brain. The regions of white matter include the posterior funiculus, which sits between the posterior gray horns and the posterior median sulcus. It contains sensory tracts that are axon bundles called fasciculi, and the lateral funiculus, which sits on the lateral sides of the spinal cord. It contains the sensory, the ascending, and the motor descending tracts. The anterior funiculus, which sits between the anterior gray horns and the anterior median fissure. It's the left and right anterior funiculi are interconnected by the white commissure and contains the sensory, ascending, and motor descending tracts. So here we have the tracts and the fasciculi within the spinal cord. It's I think a reasonable size. I won't necessarily zoom in for this one. So starting from the posterior here, we have the posterior funiculus, also known as the medial lemniscal pathway. And we have the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. Over here we have the lateral corticospinal tract and the cerebrospinal tract. And then we have the spinal cerebellar pathway, and here's the posterior spinal cerebellar tract and the anterior spinal cerebellar tract, and the anterolateral pathway with the lateral spinothalamic tract here and the anterior spinothalamic tract here. And you have the anterior corticospinal tract, then the reticulospinal tract, and the vestibulospinal tract, and the tectospinal tract. Okay. And then representative cross sections of the spinal cord. Kind of cool here to be able to see the differences in relative recognition of size difference here, which has to do with the amount of nerves coming to the area, with the cervical spine having a tremendous amount due to the brain. So it's naturally going to have more larger, although the cervical vertebrae won't be bigger, the nerves are. Okay, so here we have basically showing a cross-sectional cut here, essentially, about middle of our C-spine, like C3, C4 in that area there. We have the posterior median sulcus and the anterior median fissure, and it's a fairly good sized here. Then you have thoracic, which is a little smaller because the thoracic spine is right in the middle of the body. It's not really specifically innervating a large amount from the brain, and it's also not taking a large amount from the lower body, like lumbar. And so lumbar is going to be slightly larger than thoracic. And of course, that thoracic is going to have the posterior horn, the lateral horn, like we mentioned, that T1 to L2, where you see the lateral horn there, and the anterior horn. Then we have the showing the gray matter and the white matter, a little bit larger size, lumbar, and very small here for the sacrum, because the sacrum is not going to innervate, have as much of nerve function there as you would see at the lumbar, thoracic, or particularly the cervical. And of course, the cauda equina being the end here. So what did you learn? You should be able to place the following structures in order for relaying sensory input in the spinal cord: the posterior horn, the sensory receptor, like the tactile receptors of the skin, the spinal nerve, and the posterior root. You should also be able to place the following structures in order for relaying motor output from the spinal cord, the skeletal muscle, the anterior horn, the effector of the skeletal muscle, spinal nerve, and anterior root. You should note what are the three types of funiculi and list the specific tracts found in each. As far as section 14.4, with sensory and motor pathways, you should be able to define a sensory pathway and a motor pathway, list the features common to all pathways, describe the general characteristics of the general sense receptors, and list the neurons of the sensory pathway chain. You should also be able to describe the three major somatosensory pathways, define a motor pathway and describe its actions, distinguish between an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron based on function and cell body location, and compare and contrast the direct and indirect motor pathways. So with the overview of the conduction pathways, spinal pathways are sensory or they're motor. The sensory pathways ascend toward the brain, and the motor pathways descend from the brain. The common pathway characteristics, pathways are paired. There's a left and a right tract. Cell locations, the axons are in the spinal cord tracts, cell bodies are in the ganglia, spinal cord gray horns, and the brain gray matter. Each pathway is made of a chain or two of two or more neurons. Most pathways, decussate. The axons cross the midline, so the brain processes information to the contralateral side, and uncrossed pathways work on the ipsilateral or same side of the body. Sensory pathways, the sensory input transmitted is through the spinal cord. It originates from the general sense receptors, of which there are two categories. The somatic sensory or somatosensory receptors, the tactile receptors, which detect characteristics of an object, and the proprioceptors, which detect stretch in joints and muscles and tendons, and the visceral sensory receptors, which detect changes like stretch in an organ. So for the categories of sensory pathways, we have our somatosensory pathways, which carry signals from the skin, the muscles, the joints. The visceral sensory pathways carry signals from the viscera, and they use a series of neurons to relay the signal to the brain. The primary or the first order of neuron, and the neuron has the peripheral ending, the cell body, the posterior ganglion, and the axon leading to the secondary neuron. And this secondary neuron is an inner neuron, and it receives the primary input, and then it extends to the tertiary neuron or the cerebellum. This tertiary third order neuron is an interneuron also. It receives the secondary neuron's input, and then it extends to the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe of the cerebrum for the sensory pathways. For the posterior funiculus or the medial lemniscal pathway, it signals about proprioception, touch, pressure, and vibration within a three neuron chain. The primary neuron relays signal from the skin to the brainstem. The peripheral receptor has the axon of the spinal nerve and the posterior root and the spinal cord. Within that cord, the axon's in the posterior funiculus. It's either its fasciculus is either cuneatus or it's fasciculus gracilis. In the medulla, the axon contacts a secondary neuron. The secondary neuron then relays the signal from the medulla to the thalamus, and the cell body of the nucleus cuneatus or the nucleus gracilis, the medulla, with the axon then decussates and or decussates, and joins the medial lemniscus. And then in the thalamus, the axon contacts a tertiary neuron. That tertiary neuron relays a signal to the primary somatosensory cortex, the postcentral gyrus. So here we have that exact pathway, basically from the primary going here, from the primary somatosensory cortex postcentral gyrus going backward here, tertiary neuron, basically the thalamus here, and then we have, we'll go closer. And we have that pathway. Let's start from the beginning here, rather than going the wrong way for you. Even though it made sense from top to bottom, we'll go bottom to top. So the pathway direction here, the information coming, the anterior root and the posterior root here. Here we have the fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus for the posterior funiculus, and the receptors for discriminative touch, precise pressure and vibration, and proprioception for the neck, the trunk, the limbs, coming here to that posterior root here. Okay, and then we're going to have basically that information is going to travel up here. Toward getting more toward the medulla oblongata, and then basically we have the nucleus gracilis here, nucleus cuneatus, the medial lemniscus, and decussation prior to entry into the medial lemniscus here, and it's going to travel up toward the midbrain. Here we have the medial secondary neuron here, the medial lemniscus here, up into that basically that thalamic region here, and the tertiary neuron, then taking it to the primary somatosensory cortex, the postcentral gyrus, or the cerebrum. For sensory pathways, the anterolateral pathway signals are related to the crude touch, pressure, pain, and temperature with a 3-neuron chain. Once again, the primary neuron relays the signal from the skin to the spinal cord. There's an axon, the spinal nerve, in the posterior root, and the axon contacts the secondary neuron, the spinal cord's posterior horn. The secondary neuron relays the signal from the spinal cord to the thalamus. The axon decussates and ascends in the contralateral white matter, either the anterior spinal thalamic tract or the lateral spinal thalamic tract. The axon then contacts the tertiary neuron in the thalamus, and the tertiary neuron then relays the signal from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. This axon contacts the target neuron in an appropriate part of the primary somatosensory cortex. So we can see here our communication pathway direction through that vertebra here, and we had the we have primary neuron here with receptors for pain, temperature, crude touch, and pressure here in this case for the anterior, to remind us again, the anterolateral pathway here. Visual always helps. And so we have the posterior horn here, and the communication coming through the either lateral spinal thalamic tract or the anterior spinal thalamic tract to the medulla oblongata, and passing through here, secondary neuron at the pons, through the midbrain to the thalamus, and then becomes to the tertiary neuron for the primary somatosensory cortex, the postcentral gyrus. Being communication coming from the right for the body, and go on to the from left side of the body, and then the opposite side of the brain. For the sensory pathways for the spinocerebral pathway, signals about perception with a two neuron chain in this case here, as opposed to 3. The primary neuron relays signal from the skin to the spinal cord. The axons in the spinal nerve and the posterior root. The axon contacts the secondary neuron, the spinal cord's posterior horn. And the secondary neuron then relays that signal from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. And then some secondary neuron axons cross while others remain ipsilateral. That could be a little different at times here. The axon ascends in either the anterior spinocerebral tract or the posterior spinocerebral tract. The axon contacts the cell within the cerebellum from there. So we'll get a closer look here for our spinocerebellar pathway. So our pathway direction here, basically going upward, right, from ascending order here. The proprioceptive input comes from the joints, the muscles, and the tendons here, coming to the posterior root showing this direction. And basically here, that feedback is going to come or be sent then to the medulla oblongata through the spinocerebral pathway, either the anterior spinocerebral tract or the posterior spinocerebral tract. And then to the secondary neuron here as it leaves the medulla oblongata to the pons and the cerebellum, and then it's going to go either the left side or the right side of the body, depending on the communications and where it's coming from. The motor pathways that control effectors such as skeletal muscles. They start in the brain, include at least 2 neurons, the upper motor neuron or the lower motor neuron. The upper motor neuron is in the motor cortex, the cerebral nucleus or the brainstem nucleus, and it contacts the lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron is in the cranial nerve nucleus or the spinal cord anterior horn. It excites the muscle. And then we have our direct pyramidal pathway of the motor pathway. It's a pathway between the brain and the skeletal muscles. It begins with the upper motor neurons and the primary motor cortex. The axons course through the internal capsule, the cerebral peduncles, cortical spinal tracts, and to the synapses with the lower motor neuron and anterior horn of the gray matter, the lower motor neuron then extending the skeletal muscle. And it's fairly complex. There could be we'll have a picture here shortly here talking about this to some extent here. The direct pyramidal pathway also includes the lateral corticospinal tracts with the upper motor neuron axons decussating within the medulla's pyramids. The axons form white tracts in lateral funiculi and contact lower motor neurons. The lower motor neurons then innervate the limb muscles for skilled movements. And the anterior corticospinal tracts have these upper motor neuron axons that form with white tracts in the anterior funiculi. They decussate the level of the spinal cord segment and the contact interneurons or lower motor neurons, and the lower motor neurons innervate the axial skeletal muscle. So here we can see that visually. So we have here, in this case, we have the decussation in the spinal cord with the lower motor neurons here. So we're talking about information coming with pathway direction from the top, from the uppermost area. Basically here, superior aspect here of the body. We have the right side of the body, cerebrum here, left side of the body, of course, here. Primary motor cortex, the precentral gyrus, information sent traveling down the internal capsule, the upper motor neurons here, through the cortical spinal tracts, the anterior and lateral tracts, going through the midbrain, the cerebral peduncle here, okay? And then through the medulla oblongata, basically the decussation of the pyramids of the medulla oblongata here, and the anterior corticospinal tract here. Then we have the lateral corticospinal tract here, and the decussation in the spinal cord occurring here with the lower motor neurons and information out to the skeletal muscles. And for the indirect pathway of the motor pathways, the upper motor neurons originate in the brainstem nuclei, and they take a complicated route to the spinal cord. The lateral pathway regulates precise movement and tone in the flexor limb muscles. It consists of cerebrospinal tracts originating in the midbrain. The medial pathway regulates the muscle tone and movements of the head, the neck, the proximal limb, and the trunk. And it consists of the reticulospinal, the tectospinal, and vestibulospinal tracts. The reticulospinal tracts are from the reticular formation. They help control reflexes related to posture and balance. The tectospinal tracts from the superior and inferior colliculi regulate reflexive orienting responses to visual and auditory stimuli, and the vestibulospinal tracts from the vestibular nuclei of the brainstem help maintain balance during sitting, standing, and walking. From a clinical view, treating spinal cord injuries for important to know later, less vital now, but vital for later. It can leave individuals paralyzed and unable to perceive sensations. The prompt use of steroids after injury may preserve muscle function. Early antibiotics have reduced number of deaths due to pulmonary and urinary infections. The neural stem cells can be used for the future to regenerate CNS axons. So what did you learn? For section 14.4, what characteristics are common to most conductive or connection pathways? What are the general locations and functions of the primary, secondary, and tertiary neurons and sensory pathways? What types of information does the posterior funiculus, the medial lemniscal pathway transmit? What are the locations and functions of upper and lower motor neurons in the motor pathways? And what are the differences between the direct and indirect motor pathways? And we'll come back to the section 14.5 spinal nerves up next.